Very nice, gentlemen. So I just want to get on to the first question, which is, what is needed for a nation to be brought together? Kind of broad conceptual question. Anyone want it? Leo?
I'd say a large amount of it has to be necessarily a shared identity. How this can be presented or presented to the people itself can differ quite greatly. Like with Germany and Italy and Israel, it was this idea of like a shared language almost, or a shared people, more like. And with Yugoslavia, it was the idea of the pan-Slavic movement, like we are all Slavs, we are all part of this greater identity. So rather than being so, I'd say uninclusive, or some probably better synonym, rather than a shared language or a shared religion or a shared culture within itself, but a shared idea of who we are as a people.
Anyone want to add to that? Ibrahim?
They do need, a shared, national sort of myth or dreams or history, something which they all have pride for, which brings them together, even if they do have certain differences between them.
Yes, that's true. I mean, something that I found quite interesting actually when researching this is the work of Benedict Anderson on nations. His book Imagined Communities is quite an interesting and impressive work. I mean, he talks about nations being sort of coterminous with borders, but his message mainly is that essentially nations are founded on more kind of exclusivity than an inclusivity, in that your nation is your group, not for someone else, pretty much. I mean, of course, we see the difference of that nowadays when we have things like immigration, etc., etc. I mean, it doesn't. Some people may argue that it threatens nations, but I mean, look, we're still the United Kingdom. But essentially, yeah, I mean, we can see that in the examples of Germany, Italy, Israel, and Yugoslavia, in that it's a shared group of identity. It's a shared nation for people of that identity, not for people of sort of extraneous to that identity.
Obviously, as well, I'd say that for the nation itself to be brought together at the time, it needs highly beneficial political circumstances, as well as great economic and political stances of all surrounding nations. For the idea of the unification of Germany, if more nations had taken a harsher stance, or Otto von Bismarck himself had been more brash in his approach, then there's a good chance that the southern German states, or perhaps even the North German Confederation within itself, would not have been able to form and then go and unify Germany as a whole. With Yugoslavia's example, only the position of the victorious Allied powers over the Central Powers, allowing for the lands of Bosnia, Croatia and Serbia to be expanded, taken into this new, Serb-led kingdom of Yugoslavia, as well as Israel was backed by the massive Zionist movements, as well as, to some extent, the United States, and to a much, much more limited extent, the British Empire, although that's debatable at best.
Well, yeah, I mean, that certainly did morph into an opposition towards the end of the British time in the Mandate of Palestine. But that is an interesting point you raised, Leo, because, of course, you can't have a nationalistic identity with any kind of legs if you don't have the power behind it, the money behind it. Leo, you want to say something more?
I'd say this is what really differs these nations, which have been successful to unify and successful to rally around an actual state. And a nation which itself today, while it has the definite want, the will, the people and the culture and identity behind it, have not been able to really branch out into a state of themselves. I'd say Kurdistan would be a good example of this.
Yeah.
It fulfills all of our criteria, but surrounding political circumstances may not see to an independent Kurdish state.
Yeah, that's a very good point you raised there, actually, Leo. But to move on to the next question, I wanted to touch on the fact that, of course, whilst Germany and Italy were founded in a kind of similar era, Israel and Yugoslavia were, of course, much later. So how do we think the reasons for unification change over time? Anyone? Oh, Leo again. Very much.
Sure.
Very much appreciated.
No. I'd say it's highly... The broad reasons in and of itself of wanting a nation for the people of the said nation, obviously it applies to all of them, otherwise there wouldn't be a nation state. However, the reasons for which they unified at the time were highly specialised, I'd say, to each different circumstance, relating to my sort of earlier point of the kind of different political, economic, social factors kind of converging in allowing for the nation's state to form. For Italy and Germany, they were formed around the same times for similar-ish sorts of reasons. And for Israel and Yugoslavia, it's highly adapted to the time. For while, yes, throughout these periods, we can notice that there were the moves of Zionism and so on and so forth, as well as the Pan-Slavic movement, only at those times did they really convalesce to a point where they could form a nation.
Lucian?
Yeah.
I'd say also, particularly with Israel and Yugoslavia, one big issue that I think shifted it would have also been partly the world wars, because I think there was a global shift to certain ideas and identities. I mean, for example, when you look at the creation of Israel, I think just 40 years before, the idea would have been like seen as a complete surprise to anybody. But there was a big shift in these the First and Second World War, likewise with Yugoslavia, which arguably you could say was almost triggered by Slavic nationalism, as one of the assassins for Franz Ferdinand, I think, was a Slavic nationalist.
Yes, he was.
And you see then there's almost a great shift in an Overton window you get these issues for unification, nationalism. And I think the problem is, though, with these states, whilst they get created as part of a global shift, they get created so fast and so quickly. Quite often there comes a lot of problems and troubles that are unforeseen with their creation.
Go on, James.
Well, I would say as well with Israel, it's quite a unique case compared to the others, as Israel was the only one where it's really, you have this nation created where the people who inhabit that nation are brought in from the outside, whereas all the others, it was the people already living there coming together and uniting around an already existing in that area identity. Whereas with Israel, it's this idea that these people who have no land need an identity, and the nation is being created with the purpose of serving these people to come into it, rather than it already being there and continuing in much the same way as it already functioned.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point, James, because, of course, when Israel was founded in 1948, there were, of course, a sizable amount of Jews in the area. So you could, I suppose, argue that makes it somewhat similar to the European ones, in that it was a lot of people living in the area who kind of coalesced together to form a nation. But it's a very valid point in that it sort of separates Israel as unique in terms of a nation that's created, because it's essentially created by mass migration into an area and kind of imperio in imperio.
Well, I would agree with you that by the time of the creation of Israel, there were indeed a sizable number of Jews living in the area. However, the number only increased to such a great amount because of the fact that the concept of a nation for the Jews was being discussed, and by the time that immigration really took off, seemed to be a plausible possibility of what might happen in the near future.
Ibrahim?
I mean, when we look at these different time periods, as you were saying, when we look at Italy and Yugoslavia, they both have these, someone in the north of Italy couldn't understand someone in the south of Italy before unification. It was even greater linguistic divisions than Serbo-Croatian. You've got, massive cultural differences, political issues, and yet Italy comes out fully unified to this day, and Yugoslavia doesn't. I mean, obviously you have Mussolini who makes major changes to unify the state, but when you look at it, it seems that it's always external factors which cause a collapse of the state, or economic factors. The political side comes after, like with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia, it has all of these crises around the same time, death of Tito, then you have the fall of the Warsaw Pact, fall of communism. So that's what sort of caused that collapse. Maybe if those didn't all happen at the same time, or Tito had set up some sort of, future, you might not have seen that. So when we talk about it, I think it's important not to see it as inevitable, or, not to say that it's these factors specifically which cause that. It always links back to economics and things like that, even when those social and cultural things do exist.
Leo?
I'd certainly agree with the point that we can't look at these things happening as a complete inevitability. And it is important to realise that when looking at these histories, we are looking with a great deal of hindsight. It is very easy to criticise with hindsight behind us, but for the figures of the day, these would have been very different issues where we've studied them in books. These were actual political issues that had to be confronted. However, it is important to stress that these were a multitude of factors. It's very rare, almost to the point of impossibility, that there's ever just simply one factor that it can ever be attributed to, like economics, politics, or major wars. There's always a number of supporting factors that definitely have to be considered when talking about the dissolution or why certain nations weren't successful. Like for Yugoslavia, obviously economics would be a massive part of it, but also the burgeoning populist and nationalist movements that were springing up at the same time.
Right? Yeah.
In Serbia, as well as just Bosnian groups and Croatian groups, as well as the greater amount of devolution that was taking place, which was fostering a greater and greater sense of national identity.
And just to get on to the next question then, we've talked about national identity before with regard to the founding of nations, but how exactly do you think was this national identity forged in the different ones? Because of course they're all very unique in and of themselves. Anyone? James?
Well, I would say that certainly in the case of Israel, it's not just nationalism, but there is also this sense of a religious identity, of course, being founded on this Jewish idea. As you know, the Jews have been a people without a home for pretty much the past 2,000 years at this point, and it's quite a new idea that they need somewhere for them to be safe and to live. And not only is that you're sort of seeing this shift from what was before a religious identity, the Jewish identity as a religion, sort of shifting to become now a national identity and a people who all share the same customs and traditions in the same way as an already existing nation has that sense of identity.
Well, I suppose with the example of Israel and Judaism, I suppose we can treat Judaism more of as a kind of ethno-religion than simply a religion that one can convert to, like, say, Islam or Christianity. I mean, there is that shared ethnicity there. I mean, if anyone wants to talk about Yugoslavia as well, it'd be quite an interesting comparison. Go on, Leo.
I'd like to rely upon a commonality, I think, of all of these, not limited to just Yugoslavia or Israel, but also encompassing the wider Germany and Italy. That these are all formed on the coattails of Bismarck's very famous Iron and Blood, forming these nations. Germany was coaxed, the southern states of Germany were coaxed into the wider German nation through the threat of France. Italy was formed in the various Italian wars of unification. Israel came about after the Second World War, after the mass persecution of the Jews. And Yugoslavia, as we previously said, followed the First World War. So in these cases of national identity developing, I'd say a good amount of this also would have to be contributed to them following major/massive wars, which were undoubtedly very significant in rallying or gathering the people of the region into a single identity of which they could then call themselves members of the Yugoslav or Israeli or Italian or German state to differing degrees of, effectiveness.
Lucian?
Yeah. Building off what Leo said when he says how quite often they can be forged through wars or conflicts that rally this sense of a national identity. I think, though, one of the inevitable downfalls for a lot of these nations that get created is because this threat to their national identity can sometimes fall. Yugoslavia, for example, a big impact on it was the ending of the Cold War, because in a financial and economic sense they lost funding from both sides. But also it lost the point of their existence, the idea that they were a state that would neither side with the USSR or the West. And that was a big cornerstone to their identity, which is why inevitably, when you haven't got a bigger threat, you start to argue amongst yourselves.
Ibrahim?
I mean, on the religious side of things, obviously you have Israel, which has a large part of its identity based on the Jewish faith. And when you contrast that with Yugoslavia or Germany, that's not really the same sort of factor. I mean, Yugoslavia's case, it's a big dividing factor. You have Orthodox, Catholics, all sorts, and even Muslims in Bosnia. And those are big dividing factors. In Germany, it's a much different issue. It's more of a political party division. It's not really a factor. So you can see that even though religion is always a decent part of their identity, it doesn't seem to be defining almost. As much as Israel is founded upon Judaism, a lot of their leaders were secular. They didn't actually believe in their religion in a way that you would. And of course in Italy they're all Catholic, so that's not really an issue. But when you look at that, you can see how even though these factors seem to be heavily influenced by religion, on the ground it's not always the main factor.
Yeah, that's an interesting point actually, Ibrahim, because yeah, like you say, religion was a way in which people were kind of divided and split apart in Yugoslavia, but formed a really united identity in Israel, in Italy, and to a certain extent in Germany as well. But on that note, comparing how nations fell apart and how they sort of were formed as well, I want to get on to the last question, which is, why has unification lasted in Germany and Italy and Israel, but it failed in Yugoslavia? Does anyone care to answer? You, Lucian?
Well, I'd say on Yugoslavia, to paraphrase, I think it was once said, how can like a nation with I think it was 2 alphabets, several like religions, languages, cultural identities, and even their history being split between multiple empires over multiple years, saying how it could form to create one state. And I suppose the problem was that there were these diversity and divides that ultimately were just too powerful on a regional level to get a nationalist layer over it all to solidify it. As I think within Germany, Italy and Israel, they all had a certain element that was really strongly unifying it. I mean, with Israel, a big part of it would have been like the religion of Judaism, and likewise in Italy, they had, for example, things like historical heritage and Catholicism. And likewise, even with Germany, it had been at parts into similar kind of borders to what was once a German-like state. So I suppose one of the problems with Yugoslavia was it was created so quickly, despite there being so much divides, that there was never really a true way it could be unified permanently.
Leo?
I would dispute that claim to a certain extent. By saying that it could never form in this kind of way. We're looking at the Yugoslav history, as we previously said, from quite a view with quite a good deal of hindsight to be able to back this up. I mean, I'd more heavily attribute the factors of the actual day, making the Yugoslav state highly untenable, to its dissolution, rather than alighting to this idea that the divided history would be more of a reason behind the Yugoslav state failing. I mean, there's been many, many examples of initially disunified people coming together under a more shared identity, and states that have been going into the 21st century. I mean, the United Kingdom actually would be quite a good example I could think of, because Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, as it currently is, have actually had for most of their history quite a long, glorious history of fighting against each other, killing each other, but still have, although English has dominated as the language, they still have managed to retain their own regional identities, their own regional languages, dialects, alphabets. Like Welsh is still spoken to some extent in Wales. And they still have these strong ideas of national identity. I mean, the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, it was only 45% who voted for independence, only a 5% margin of them not actually leaving the Union. And through these kinds of examples, I would put more of a heavy emphasis on the decisions of the leaders of the time, the election of Slobodan Milosevic to lead, as well as the economics of the situation, making the nation untenable, being the main reasons behind dissolution.
James?
Whilst I would agree with what you said, I do think Lucian has a big point in bringing up the languages, whereas like before Italy unified, they had several dialects, but after unification they had one which became the official Italian that we speak today, or Italian speakers do. And the same in Germany, and obviously in Israel you actually get this sort of revival of Hebrew where they bring it back as a national language. And I think without that national languages, the differences between the people of that country just are far more outlined, and it's easier to see where the divide is. Whereas once you have a language, you can start to build on that identity, that shared culture and history, and all the other differences can start to be rectified between the different parties. But without that, with that language barrier still in place, it's much harder to bring together the different communities and try to convince them that they are one people.
Yeah, so, Ibrahim, you wanted to say something, did you?
Yeah.
Yeah, go on.
I mean, I think we're looking at it from an outside view here, but if you actually go to what was formerly Yugoslavia, Serbian and Croatian are mutually the same. You know, of course, Slovenian is its own language, but even though we talk about there's obviously big differences, it's still the same language. And of course, Italy did have different dialects until Mussolini did his standardization, but it's not really enough. If people can converge together, that will help a country stay unified. Language is a big part of identity, but I don't think it's the only factor. I mean, China, you've made different languages, India, the past USSR, it's not always the biggest thing.
Yeah, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here, gentlemen, but judging from what we've learned about these different countries, and with a specific view to Yugoslavia now, we're seeing lots of, I won't call them nationalists, it's not really nationalists, but kind of growing independence movements within the United Kingdom, like, for example, in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. How do we think our knowledge of Yugoslavia and how that ended up sort of translates to our current situation in the UK? Like, how do we think, with our knowledge of history, the likelihood of the union splitting up is? Leo? Yeah, go on.
In the current sense, I don't think the threat of Northern Irish or Scottish independence is really a massive one as it currently stands. The SNP has recently taken a massive battering in the 2024 elections. If they then subsequently get massively defeated in the 2026 MSP elections, I think they're being held, then it's going to signal quite a significant downturn for Scottish independence. Same with Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin has seen a massive downturn in their popularity. However, even if the independence referendums were to go ahead, I would respect the fact, I would more like the fact, sorry, if I can get my words out correctly, that there would be quite a peaceful dissolution of the union. I heavily doubt that we'd have a violent breakup of the United Kingdom, and yeah, that's my main view on it, really. I heavily doubt a violent breakup.
I'd say the other thing as well, that a big factor for maybe the downfall of Yugoslavia with the other states in relation to the United Kingdom is a lot of the other ones could be seen maybe to have solidified their nationality more, their identity more, because of, say, external threats, whilst I think Yugoslavia's downfall might be, in a sense, almost due to a lack of it, as it was the deterioration of the Cold War that really brought internal threats to highlight it. So whilst there might be a lot of internal problems within the UK now, I think, judging by a world view of it, I think there's now less of a chance for a breaking up of the union, because I think they'd prefer it to be that united we are stronger.
Ibrahim?
I think it's important to distinguish Scottish independence from the SNP, and I think we've seen that in the past years. Although the SNP has had major issues in the 2024 general election, Scottish independence hasn't dwindled at all. After Brexit, it's remained fairly stable until Boris Johnson messed around a bit too much. But I think when we look at the union, a lot of the benefits we lost during Brexit, and obviously with the government failing to combat internal issues, that is a major factor, quite similar to Yugoslavia. Obviously, I think if a war were to break out internationally, that would postpone anything. But unless we deal with internal problems, independence, especially in Scotland, is a decent possibility.
Right, well, despite our severe digression, which I do apologise for, I'd like to bid you all, the listeners, farewell for this week's episode of 21 Minutes in the Past. We will be joining you back after Christmas, after New Year. I'm not actually sure what Mr. Barker has in store for us next. Oh, he's writing something on the board. Oh, yes. It is the 50th episode today, which I unfortunately failed to mention at the beginning. But yes, 50 episodes, 21 minutes in the past. It's been a pleasure, and I'm sure, yes, everyone on the team would agree. And yes, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next term.